They saw a hoodie, ripped jeans, and dark skin, and they assumed she was a runaway or a charity case. When 16-year-old Sandra Vance sat in seat 1A of first class, the flight crew didn't just mock her, they actively conspired to humiliate her. Brenda, the senior attendant, laughed in her face, threatening to drag her off the plane for theft of services. They thought she was powerless. They were wrong. They didn't realize that the black SUVs racing across the tarmac weren't coming to arrest Sandra. They were coming to salute her. By the time the cabin doors opened, careers would end, and the airline would face a wrath worth billions. The fluorescent lights of JFK International Airport hummed with a low, headache-inducing buzz. It was 8 a.m. on a Tuesday, the peak of the morning rush, and Terminal 4 was a sea of business suits, rolling luggage, and frantic parents. Moving through the crowd like a ghost was 16-year-old Sandra Vance. She didn't look like the typical clientele for Royal Meridian Airways transatlantic flight to London. She wore a slightly oversized charcoal hoodie, vintage denim jeans with intentional tears at the knees, and scuffed high-top sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and large, noise-cancelling headphones rested around her neck. To the casual observer, she looked like a tired teenager, perhaps traveling to visit a distant relative, or maybe a student on a budget. She approached the priority check-in counter, the one marked with red velvet ropes and a gold sign that read, "First Class and Diamond Medallion, Members Only." Standing behind the podium was Gary Thorne. Gary was a man in his late 40s who wore his uniform a size too tight, a desperate attempt to hold on to his youth. He prided himself on being the gatekeeper of the elite experience. He scanned the line, offering obsequious smiles to men in Italian suits, but his expression curdled when he saw Sandra duck under the rope. "Excuse me," Gary barked, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Miss, you're in the wrong lane." Sandra paused, adjusting her backpack. She looked up, her eyes calm and dark. "This is the first-class check-in for Flight 882 to London, right?" Gary let out a short, derisive snort. He didn't look at her documents. He looked at her shoes. "It is. Which is why you need to be over there." He pointed a manicured finger toward the chaotic economy line that snaked back toward the entrance doors. "Economy and coach drop-off is that way. You're blocking the path for our actual priority guests." "I have a ticket," Sandra said softly. She held out her phone, the screen displaying a QR code with the distinct gold border of a first-class boarding pass. Gary didn't reach for the scanner. He crossed his arms, leaning over the podium with a sneer. "Look, kid, I don't know if you screenshotted your daddy's ticket or if you're trying to pull a TikTok prank, but I don't have time for it. We have Senator Higgins arriving in 10 minutes. Move along." The people in line behind Sandra began to shuffle impatiently. A woman with a Louis Vuitton tote bag sighed loudly, checking her watch. "Come on, let's go," someone muttered. Sandra didn't flinch. She had been raised in boardrooms and embassies. She knew how to handle bullies in cheap suits. "My name is Sandra Vance. I'm booked in seat 1A. If you scan the code, it will clear. If you refuse to scan the code, you are denying boarding to a ticketed passenger without cause. I believe that's a violation of federal aviation regulations, Gary." She read his name tag deliberately. Gary's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. The audacity of this teenager, this black teenager, lecturing him on regulations made a vein in his temple throb. He snatched the scanner aggressively. "Fine," he spat. "But when this beeps red, I'm calling security to have you escorted out of the terminal for loitering." He aimed the laser at her phone screen, praying for a rejection tone. Beep, beep, green light. The screen on Gary's monitor flashed. "Passenger. Vance Sandra. Status. VIP. Priority. Highest. Gary stared at the screen. The system had to be broken. There was no way this girl was highest priority. That code was reserved for diplomats and A-list celebrities. He looked back at her, convinced she had hacked the system. "The machine is glitching," Gary lied, his voice loud enough for the queue to hear. "It's flagging this as a fraudulent purchase. Stolen credit card, likely." The crowd gasped. The woman with the Louis Vuitton bag stepped forward. "Oh, for heaven's sake, I knew it. Security." Sandra's expression hardened. "It's not stolen. Check the card on file. It's a corporate black card issued to Vance Global." "I'm not checking anything," Gary snapped, feeling the power of the crowd on his side. "Step aside. I'm going to process these paying customers, and then I'm going to deal with you and the police." Sandra took a deep breath. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming black phone. Not her smartphone, but a satellite device. She pressed one button. "Gary," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "You have exactly 10 seconds to print my boarding pass and check my bag, or you will explain to your station manager why you delayed a shareholder." Gary laughed. Actually laughed. "Shareholder? Listen to yourself. You're delusional." Suddenly, the printer behind Gary whirred to life. It spat out a boarding pass with a golden stripe. His monitor flashed a message from the central dispatch. "Override authorized. Board passenger immediately." Gary froze. He looked around, confused. He hadn't touched the keyboard. "My pass?" Sandra held out her hand. Gary, trembling with a mix of rage and confusion, ripped the paper from the machine and shoved it at her. "Don't think this is over," he whispered. "I'm radioing the crew. They'll keep an eye on you. One wrong move and you're off." Sandra took the pass, adjusted her headphones, and walked away. "Have a nice day, Gary." The walk down the jet bridge was usually a transition into luxury, but for Sandra, it felt like walking into a trap. Gary had made good on his threat. As she stepped onto the plane, the atmosphere was icy. Brenda Miller, the purser and lead flight attendant, was waiting at the door. Brenda was a woman who wore her authority like a weapon. She had stiff, blonde hair, sprayed into a helmet of perfection, and a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating blue eyes. She greeted the businessman ahead of Sandra with warmth. "Welcome back, Mr. Henderson. Can I get you a glass of champagne before takeoff?" Then she saw Sandra. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pinched disapproval, as if she smelled something rotting. Sandra stepped aboard, holding her boarding pass out. "Seat 1A. Brenda didn't take the pass. She blocked the aisle with her body. "Hold on, let me see that." She snatched the paper, scrutinizing it under the cabin lights, rubbing the ink with her thumb to see if it was fake. 1A? This is a mistake." "It's not a mistake," Sandra said, feeling the eyes of the entire cabin on her. "Seat 1A is reserved for full-fare passengers," Brenda announced loudly. "This ticket must be an employee pass or a standby upgrade that got processed wrong. We have a Diamond Medallion member who requested the bulkhead. You need to move." "I paid full fare," Sandra stated. "I selected 1A 3 weeks ago." Brenda scoffed, leaning in close, her voice dripping with condescension. "Look, sweetie, we don't do this here. We have respectable people trying to relax. I'm going to do you a favor and find you a seat in economy comfort. You'll have more leg room for your type of crowd." "My type of crowd?" Sandra repeated. The question hung heavy in the air. "Young people," Brenda corrected quickly, though the racial undertone was deafening. "Loud. Rowdy. First class is a quiet zone." "I haven't said a word other than to ask for my seat," Sandra said, stepping around Brenda. She moved toward 1A, a spacious suite with a lie-flat bed. She tossed her backpack into the overhead bin and sat down. Brenda turned purple. She marched over to the cockpit door, whispered something to the pilot, and then stormed back to Sandra's seat. "Fine," Brenda hissed. "But if I hear a peep out of you, if you play your music too loud, if you disturb Mr. Henderson, if you so much as sneeze wrong, I am having the captain turn this plane around. Do you understand me?" Sandra didn't look up. She had already opened a book on advanced calculus. "I understand that you're providing terrible service, Brenda. Could I get a water, please?" Brenda stared at her, her mouth agape. "The water," she said through gritted teeth, "is for guests during meal service. You can wait." As Brenda walked away, Mr. Henderson in 1B, a kind-looking older man with white hair, leaned over. "Miss, I'm sorry about her. I don't know what her problem is." "I do," Sandra said quietly. "She thinks I don't belong here." "Well," Henderson smiled, "you handle yourself better than most CEOs I know." Sandra offered a weak smile. She just wanted to get to London. Her father, Marcus Vance, was closing the merger between Vance Hargrave Tech and a British defence firm. She was supposed to meet him for the celebratory dinner. She didn't want trouble. But trouble, it seemed, was determined to find her. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin was darkened. Most passengers were sleeping. Sandra was watching a documentary on her screen, her headphones on. She needed to use the restroom. She quietly unbuckled her belt and stood up. The first-class lavatory was just a few feet away at the front of the cabin. As she reached for the handle, Brenda emerged from the galley, blocking her path again. "The restroom is occupied," Brenda lied. The sign clearly said, "Vacant" in green. "The sign says green," Sandra pointed out. "It's broken," Brenda snapped. "You have to use the one in the back, behind row 40. "That's the entire length of the plane," Sandra said. "I am a first-class passenger. I am entitled to use the first-class lavatory. And I am the chief stewardess, telling you that this bathroom is for priority maintenance," Brenda smirked. "Walk to the back. Exercise is good for you." Sandra sighed. It wasn't worth the fight. She began the long walk down the aisle, through business, through premium economy, and into the back of the plane. As she walked, she could feel the eyes of other passengers. When she returned 10 minutes later, chaos had erupted in the first-class cabin. All the lights were on. Brenda was standing in the aisle, pointing a finger at Sandra's empty seat. A woman from seat 2A, a socialite named Mrs. van der Hoven, was clutching her pearls, looking theatrically distressed. "There she is!" Brenda shouted, as Sandra stepped back through the curtain. Sandra stopped. "What is going on?" "Don't play innocent with me," Brenda said, her voice trembling with faux rouge. Mrs. van der Hoven's diamond tennis bracelet was on her tray table. She went to sleep. When she woke up, it was gone. "You're the only one who has been walking up and down the aisle." Sandra felt her blood run cold. "I went to the bathroom. You told me to go to the back." "A convenient excuse to roam the cabin," Brenda accused. "Empty your pockets. Now." "I didn't take anything," Sandra said firmly, her voice rising slightly. "Check the floor. Check her bag." "We checked everywhere," Mrs. van der Hoven wailed. "It's a $20,000 bracelet. That girl took it. I saw her looking at me earlier." "I haven't looked at you once," Sandra said. "I am not asking," Brenda said, stepping forward, looming over Sandra. "I am telling you. Give it back, or we will have the police waiting for you in London." "Actually, no. I'm not waiting for London." Brenda grabbed the interphone and keyed the pilot. "Captain, we have a situation. We have a theft in progress, and the suspect is becoming belligerent. I don't feel safe. We need to divert." The cabin gasped. Mr. Henderson stood up. Now wait a minute. This is ridiculous. She didn't take anything. I've been awake the whole time. Sit down, sir, Brenda yelled. Unless you want to be charged as an accomplice. She turned back to Sandra, a twisted smile of triumph on her face. You picked the wrong flight, little girl. You thought you could use your fake ticket and steal from the rich? We're diverting to Gander, Newfoundland. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police will handle you. Sandra looked Brenda dead in the eye. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She reached into her hoodie pocket. Brenda flinched, expecting a weapon. Sandra pulled out her satellite phone again. Put that away, Brenda screamed, swatting at Sandra's hand. No phones allowed. Sandra dodged the slap and pressed the emergency distress button on the side of the device. It wasn't a normal distress signal. It was a code black beacon used by high-risk executives and their families. It sent a signal not to the police, but to Vance Global Security Command. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Brenda, Sandra said calmly. Sit down, Brenda shrieked. She grabbed a pair of plastic flex cuffs from the emergency kit. I am restraining you for the safety of the flight. Brenda and a junior flight attendant, who looked terrified but followed orders, forced Sandra into her seat. They zip-tied her hands together. Sandra didn't resist. She sat back against the leather seat, the plastic digging into her wrists. She looked out the window as the plane banked sharply to the left, beginning its descent toward the remote Canadian airport. She closed her eyes and counted backward from 100. She knew what was happening. The beacon had been triggered. The signal included her biometrics and location. Somewhere in a command center in Virginia, a screen had just turned red. The Boeing 777 descended through the thick, grey cloud layer of Newfoundland. The captain, Captain Miller, no relation to Brenda, but equally arrogant, had announced to the passengers that they were making an emergency landing due to a security threat involving a passenger. When the wheels slammed onto the tarmac of Gander International Airport, the mood inside the plane was toxic. The passengers were furious about the delay, and Brenda had successfully directed all that fury toward Sandra. I hope you're happy, Mrs. van der Hoeven spat from the row behind, ruining everyone's trip. Sandra sat silently, her wrists bound. She knew the truth. The bracelet was likely in the woman's purse, or slipped down the side of the seat. But truth didn't matter to people like Brenda. Power mattered. The plane taxied to a remote part of the airfield, far from the terminal. It was snowing lightly outside. Stay in your seats, Brenda commanded the cabin. The police are boarding to remove the suspect. The cabin door opened. The freezing wind swirled in. 2 local police officers stepped on board, looking confused. They had been told there was a violent threat. They saw a 16-year-old girl zip-tied in a hoodie. Is this the suspect? One officer asked, his hand resting on his belt. Yes, Brenda pointed a shaking finger. She stole jewelry and threatened the crew. She's dangerous. The officer approached Sandra. Miss, you're under arrest for theft and interfering with a flight crew. Stand up. Sandra stood up slowly. The jewelry is in her bag, she said calmly, nodding to Mrs. van der Hoeven. And I suggest you look out the window before you touch me. Quiet, the officer barked. He reached for her arm to pull her into the aisle. Suddenly, a roar drowned out the wind. It was the sound of engines, not jet engines, but helicopters. Through the open cabin door, everyone saw it. 2 blacked-out military-grade helicopters banked low over the airfield, their rotors kicking up a storm of snow. At the same time, 3 large black SUVs tore across the tarmac, ignoring airport security protocols. They screeched to a halt right at the bottom of the mobile stairs. The police officer froze. Who is that? Is that Special Ops? Men in tactical gear spilled out of the SUVs. They didn't look like local police. They wore black uniforms with no insignia, just a small silver V on their chests. They carried assault rifles, held at the low ready. The lead man, a giant of a human being named Luther Graves, stormed up the stairs. Luther was the head of executive protection for Vance Global. He was 6'5", bald, and had a scar running down his cheek. He looked like a man who ate tanks for breakfast. The local police officers instinctively stepped back, their hands raising. "Whoa, hold on, who are you?" Luther ignored them. He stepped into the cabin, his presence filling the space. He scanned the room and locked eyes with Brenda. Brenda, who had been so loud and powerful moments ago, suddenly looked very small. Then Luther saw Sandra. He saw the zip ties. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Luther's face went from professional stone to lethal rage. "Who?" Luther rumbled, his voice like grinding gravel. "Put cuffs on her." Brenda stammered. She is a criminal. Who are you? You can't be here. This is a sterile area." Luther walked past the police officers as if they weren't there. He pulled a knife from his vest, a large, serrated combat blade. Mrs. van der Hoeven screamed. Luther gently took Sandra's hands and sliced through the plastic zip ties in one fluid motion. He checked her wrists for bruises. "Are you hurt, Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I'm okay, Luther," Sandra said, rubbing her wrists. "Just humiliated." Luther turned slowly to face Brenda and the captain, who had just emerged from the cockpit. "You," Luther pointed at the captain. "You diverted a Vance Global aircraft." "Vance Global?" The captain blinked. "This is a Royal Meridian flight." "Check your ownership logs, genius," Luther snarled. "Royal Meridian was acquired by Vance Holdings at 9:00 a.m. this morning. My boss, Julian Vance, owns this plane. He owns this airline. And you just arrested his daughter." The silence in the cabin was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Brenda's face went white. "His daughter?" "And," Luther continued, turning to Mrs. van der Hoeven, "we scanned the cabin with thermal imaging from the drone before we boarded. The stolen bracelet. It's inside the lining of your carry-on bag. You dropped it." Luther reached over, grabbed Mrs. van der Hoeven's bag, unzipped a side pocket, and shook it. The diamond bracelet fell onto the floor with a clatter. "Oops," Sandra whispered. Luther tapped his earpiece. "Boss? We have her. She's safe, but you're going to want to hear what they did to her." He looked at Brenda, who was now trembling so hard her teeth chattered. "Brenda Miller," Luther said, reading her name tag. "Mr. Vance is on the video link. He wants to speak to you. Now." Luther held out a tablet. On the screen was the face of Julian Vance, one of the richest men in the world, and he looked murderous. The wind outside howled across the Newfoundland tarmac, but inside the cabin of the Boeing 7707, the silence was heavier than lead. Luther Graves held the tablet up with a steady, granite-like hand. On the screen, Julian Vance, the CEO of Vance Global and a man whose net worth rivaled the GDP of small nations, sat in a dimly lit office in New York. His face was calm, which was far more terrifying than if he were screaming. "Brenda Miller!" Julian's voice came through the tablet speakers, crisp and amplified. "Look at me." Brenda, shaking so violently, her flight attendant scarf fluttered, forced her eyes to the screen. Mr. Vance, I didn't know. Nobody told me." "You didn't know she was my daughter?" Julian asked softly. "Tell me, Brenda, if she were not my daughter, if she were just a 16-year-old girl traveling alone who had paid for a ticket, would your behavior have been acceptable?" Brenda stammered, looking for an exit that didn't exist. She looked suspicious. She didn't fit the profile. I was protecting the passengers." "The profile," Julian repeated, tasting the word like spoiled milk. You mean the color of her skin and the style of her clothes? You profiled a child, humiliated her, denied her services she paid for, and then fabricated a theft to cover your own incompetence. Mrs. van der Hoeven said her bracelet was stolen, Brenda shrieked, pointing at the socialite who was currently trying to shrink into her seat. Mrs. van der Hoeven. Julian's eyes shifted on the screen, addressing the woman in 2A. My security team has already run a background check on you while this plane was descending. Your husband, Richard, works for a subsidiary of Sterling Bank, doesn't he? Mrs. van der Hoeven paled. Yes. What does that have to do with this? Sterling Bank handles the payroll accounts for Vance Global, Julian said dryly. Or they did. As of 5 minutes ago, I have ordered the transfer of all our corporate accounts to your competitor. Your husband is going to have a very interesting conversation with his boss tomorrow morning about why the bank lost its biggest client because his wife couldn't keep track of her jewelry. Mrs. van der Hoeven burst into tears. No, you can't do that. It's done, Julian said, dismissing her. He looked back at Brenda and Captain Miller. Now, regarding the crew. Captain, you allowed a purser to dictate the security of your ship without verifying the threat. You diverted a transatlantic flight based on racial bias. That is gross negligence. I followed protocol, the captain argued, though his voice was weak. You followed prejudice, Julian corrected. And here is the reality. I didn't just buy your ticket, Captain. I didn't just buy the plane. While you were in the air, my legal team executed a hostile takeover of Royal Meridian Airways. The deal closed at 10:45 a.m. Julian leaned into the camera, his eyes cold blue steel. I am your employer, and I am firing you, both of you, for cause, effective immediately. You are no longer authorized to fly this aircraft. Brenda gasped. You can't leave us here, in Gander, in the snow. You are trespassing on private property, Luther Graves interjected, his voice booming in the cabin. This plane belongs to Vance Global now. You are no longer crew. You are unauthorized civilians. Luther signaled to his tactical team. Escort Mr. Miller and Ms. Miller off the aircraft. They can find their own way back to New York. I believe there is a Greyhound bus station in town. No, please! Brenda grabbed onto a seat back. I have a pension. I have 20 years of seniority. You have nothing, Julian said from the screen. And Brenda, you will be hearing from my personal attorneys regarding the false imprisonment of a minor and defamation of character. You won't just be unemployed. You will be unhireable. 2 tactical officers grabbed Brenda and the captain by the arms. As they were dragged down the aisle, kicking and screaming, the economy passengers, who had been watching the drama unfold through the open curtains, erupted into applause. Luther turned to Sandra. Miss Vance, your father is sending the Gulfstream to pick you up. It will be here in 30 minutes. But first, Luther turned to the local Canadian police officer, who was standing there, completely bewildered. Officer, Luther said, I believe you have a false police report to file. The officer looked at Brenda, who was being hauled down the stairs into the snow, and then at the diamond bracelet on the floor. He nodded grimly. Yeah, I think I do. Filing a false report is a criminal offense in Canada. We'll go pick her up at the tarmac gate. Sandra stood up, rubbing her wrist where the zip ties had been. She looked at Mr. Henderson, the kind man in 1B. I'm sorry for the delay, she said softly. Mr. Henderson chuckled, raising his glass of champagne. My dear, that was the best in-flight entertainment I have ever witnessed. Go get 'em. The fallout did not happen all at once. It began as a tremor, a digital vibration that started the moment Mr. Henderson uploaded his video from the tarmac in Gander. But within 48 hours, that tremor had become a catastrophic earthquake that would level the lives of everyone who had stood in Sandra Vance's way. It started with the silence of the cell phones, then the screaming of the notifications. Gary Thorne sat in his dimly lit one-bedroom apartment in Queens. It was a Tuesday, his day off, but he hadn't slept. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since 4 a.m. with text messages from co-workers, friends, and even his ex-wife. He hadn't answered any of them. He sat on his worn-out beige sofa, staring at the television. The local news was on mute, but the chyron at the bottom of the screen was screaming in bright red letters, "Airline racism scandal. Vance Global sues for millions." Gary took a sip of lukewarm coffee, his hand trembling. "It's not me," he whispered to the empty room, trying to convince himself. "I just did my job. The machine glitched. They can't prove anything." Bam! 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 The knocking on his front door shook the thin walls. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the authoritative, heavy-handed pounding of someone who legally demanded to be heard. Gary froze. He waited, hoping they would go away. "Gary Thorne, we know you're inside. Open up, or we call the superintendent to key us in." Gary shuffled to the door, unlocking the deadbolt with clammy hands. He opened it a crack. Standing in the hallway were two men. One was a process server in a cheap windbreaker. The other was a man in a sharp, charcoal-grey suit who looked like he cost $1,000 an hour. "Gary Thorne?" the suit asked. He didn't wait for an answer. "I am lead counsel for the plaintiff in the matter of Vance vs. Thorne." The process server shoved a thick, bound stack of documents into Gary's chest. The weight of the paper nearly made him stumble back. "You have been served," the server said. Gary looked down at the cover page. The words swam before his eyes. "Civil action, No. 24 CV 091. Plaintiff, Sandra Vance, Vance Global Holdings. Defendant, Gary Thorne. Charges, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil rights violations, 42 U.S.C. paragraph 1981, loss of business reputation." "I don't have any money," Gary stammered, looking up at the lawyer. "I'm just a gate agent. You can't sue me." The lawyer smiled, a shark-like baring of teeth. "We aren't just suing you for money, Mr. Thorne. We are suing for assets. We've already been granted a preliminary freeze on your bank accounts, pending the hearing. Your savings, your pension fund, your 2018 Ford F-150. It's all frozen." "My truck?" Gary's voice cracked. "You froze my truck." "We intend to garnish your wages for the next 25 years, the lawyer said calmly, checking his watch. "Or until the settlement amount of $10 million is paid. Have a nice day." Gary watched them walk away. He dropped the papers on the floor. His knees gave out, and he slid down the doorframe until he hit the carpet, realizing his life as he knew it was effectively over. 500 miles north, the reality was colder and far more confined. Brenda Miller sat in a holding cell at the Gander RCMP detachment. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. She was still wearing her Royal Meridian flight attendant uniform, though now it was rumpled, stained, and stripped of her gold wings and name tag. She had demanded to see the American ambassador. She had demanded to see the union representative. Instead, she got a court-appointed Canadian defense attorney named Mr. Levesque, a tired-looking man who seemed to have zero sympathy for her. He entered the cell and tossed a file onto the metal table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Bad news, Miss Miller," Levesque said, not bothering to sit down. "Get me out of here," Brenda hissed, trying to summon her old authority. "This is a misunderstanding. I want to go home to New York." "You aren't going to New York," Levesque said flatly. "The Crown prosecutor has decided to make an example of you. They are charging you with public mischief and filing a false police report. In Canada, that carries a maximum sentence of 5 years. 5 years? Brenda shrieked. For a bracelet? It was a mistake. It was a lie, Levesque corrected. And here is the kicker. Because the victim was a minor, and because the incident occurred on an international flight, the FBI has opened a concurrent investigation. Even if you serve your time here, you will be deported back to the US to face federal charges for interfering with a flight crew. Ironic, considering you were the crew. Brenda felt the blood drain from her face. But the airline, the union, they'll protect me. Levesque let out a dry, humorless laugh. The airline? Brenda, the airline is owned by the girl's father now. He fired the entire legal department this morning and hired his own team. The union has disavowed you. They released a statement an hour ago, calling your actions reprehensible and indefensible. You are alone. Brenda slumped onto the metal cot, staring at the grey concrete wall. The silence of the cell was deafening, broken only by the realization that she had traded her career, her freedom, and her reputation for the momentary satisfaction of bullying a teenager. In Manhattan, the atmosphere was frantic. In the corner office of a high-end law firm, Richard and Martha van der Hoeven were watching their social standing disintegrate in real time. Richard, a high-ranking executive at a major investment firm, was pacing the floor, his face a mask of fury. Martha sat in a leather chair, clutching a tissue, her eyes red and puffy. They cancelled the country club membership, Richard, Martha wailed. The committee sent an email. They said we are undesirable elements. Shut up about the damn country club, Richard roared, spinning around. I just got off the phone with the CEO of Sterling Bank. Do you know what he told me? He told me to clean out my desk. 30 years, Martha. I gave them 30 years. And I'm fired because my wife decided to frame Julian Vance's daughter for theft. I didn't know who she was, Martha sobbed. It shouldn't matter who she was, Richard yelled, throwing a crystal paperweight against the wall. It shattered, much like their future. You hid the bracelet. The forensics report is irrefutable. Your fingerprints are on the inside lining of your bag. You committed a felony. Their lawyer, a calm man named Stein, cleared his throat. Mr. and Mrs. van der Hoeven, please. We need to focus on damage control. Vance's legal team has offered a settlement to avoid criminal prosecution for the fraud. We'll pay it, Richard said quickly. How much? $1 million? 2? They don't want your money, Stein said, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Vance was very specific. He wants a confession. A public one. No. Martha shook her head frantically. I can't. Everyone will see it. If you don't, Stein warned, Mr. Vance will hand the forensic evidence to the district attorney. You will go to Rikers Island, Martha. And Richard, you will likely be named as an accessory after the fact for trying to cover it up initially. Richard walked over to his wife. He didn't hug her. He grabbed her shoulders and looked her in the eye with cold detachment. You are going to sit in front of that camera, Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. And you are going to apologize. You are going to tell the world exactly what a petty, racist liar you are. Because if you don't, and I lose the house in the Hamptons because of legal fees, I will divorce you before you even make bail. Martha trembled. The makeup she had carefully applied that morning was streaked with tears. She looked at the camera crew setting up in the corner of the lawyer's office. Fine, she whispered, broken. An hour later, the video was live. Martha van der Hoeven, stripped of her pride, looked into the lens and confessed, I targeted Sandra Vance because I didn't believe someone like her belonged in first class, she said, her voice shaking. I hid my own bracelet to get her in trouble. I am sorry. Sandra Vance watched the video from the comfort of her father's study. Julian Vance stood behind her, a hand on her shoulder. "Is it enough?" Julian asked quietly. Sandra turned off the iPad. She looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline. "It's not about being enough, Dad. It's about making sure they never do it to anyone else." "They won't," Julian promised. "They don't have the power to hurt anyone anymore." The avalanche had settled. The landscape had changed, and the path was finally clear. 1 year had passed since the incident that became known globally as the Gander Turning Point. JFK International Airport, Terminal 4, was no longer the place it used to be. The oppressive atmosphere of the old Royal Meridian check-in counters, with their velvet ropes that felt like barricades and staff who sneered at anyone earning less than 7 figures, had been completely exorcised. In its place stood the flagship terminal of Vance Aviation. The branding was sleek, modern, and intentionally welcoming. The pretentious gold and crimson color scheme of the old airline had been stripped away, replaced by a calming slate blue and silver. The rigid priority lanes that once segregated passengers like cast members were gone. Instead, open-concept kiosks and roaming agents with tablets moved through the crowd, helping everyone with equal efficiency. The most striking change, however, was the culture. Under Julian Vance's ownership and his daughter's moral compass, the airline had instituted a zero-tolerance policy for bias. But it was more than just rules. It was a vibe. The staff looked happy. They weren't stressed, overworked gatekeepers anymore. They were hosts. At 9:30 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning, a hush fell over the main concourse. It wasn't the silence of fear, but of respect. Sandra Vance walked through the automatic doors. She was 17 now, a year older and a lifetime wiser. She no longer wore the oversized hoodie that she had used as armor on that fateful flight. Today, she wore a tailored navy blazer, a crisp white shirt, and dark jeans. She looked every inch the heiress to a multi-billion-dollar empire, but she carried herself with a humility that money couldn't buy. She wasn't alone. Flanking her was Luther Graves, the mountain of a man who still served as the head of executive protection. But walking on her right was a new face, or rather, a face from the past that had been given a new future. It was Marcus King. A year ago, Marcus had been a 22-year-old ramp agent for Royal Meridian. He was the guy loading bags in the freezing rain. He had been fired by Gary Thorne 2 weeks before Sandra's incident, because Marcus had dared to let an elderly woman sit in a wheelchair in the first-class lounge while she waited for her economy flight. Gary had called it theft of services and terminated him on the spot. Sandra had found him. She had read his personnel file during the acquisition audit. She hired him back, paid for his security training, and made him the team lead for her personal detail. Now, Marcus wore a bespoke suit and an earpiece, walking with his head held high through the very terminal where he had once been treated like garbage. "Terminal is secure, Ms. Vance," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We have clear passage to gate B32. "Thanks, Marcus," Sandra smiled. "And please, I told you, in the terminal it's just Sandra." "Copy that, Sandra," Marcus grinned. They made their way toward the check-in area. But today wasn't a business trip. Today was the inaugural launch of the Vance Global Wings of Change Scholarship. Waiting by the gate were 20 high school students. They came from the toughest neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, and Detroit. They were brilliant kids, coders, engineers, artists, who had never left their home states, let alone the country. Sandra was taking them all to Tokyo for a 2-week technology and robotics summit, all expenses paid. As Sandra approached the group, she saw the nervous excitement on their faces. She saw herself in them, the hesitation, the feeling of, do I belong here? She high-fived the nearest student, a boy named Leo, who was clutching a sketchbook. "Ready for Japan, Leo?" "I think so," Leo stammered. "I've never been on a plane before." "You're going to love it," Sandra promised. "Just don't look down at takeoff if you're scared of heights." As the group organized themselves, Sandra felt a pair of eyes on her. It was a heavy, mournful gaze that she could feel prickling the back of her neck. She turned slowly toward the far wall, near the janitorial supply closet. There, holding a mop and a yellow bucket, was a man who looked decades older than his actual age. His hair was thinning and grey. His shoulders were slumped in permanent defeat. He wore a grey jumpsuit with a generic contract cleaning company logo on the chest. It was Gary Thorne. The lawsuit had been merciless. The civil judgment had taken everything: his savings, his truck, his condo in Queens. He had filed for bankruptcy, but the debt from the intentional torts wasn't dischargeable. He was ruined. The aviation industry had blacklisted him. No airline would trust him with a passenger manifest. The only work he could find was with a third-party sanitation vendor. His daily reality was cleaning the floors of the terminal he used to rule like a petty tyrant. Gary stopped mopping as Sandra looked at him. His hands gripped the wooden handle so tight his knuckles turned white. He waited for her to point. He waited for her to laugh. He waited for her to tell Marcus to have him removed from the area. He expected her to do exactly what he would have done if the roles were reversed. Sandra stared at him for a long moment. Marcus stepped forward, his body tense, ready to intercept. "Do you want me to move him along, Mom?" Sandra raised a hand. "No, Marcus. It's fine." She walked over to Gary. The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Gary flinched as she got close, his eyes darting to the floor. "Hello, Gary," Sandra said softly. Gary looked up, his eyes watery and red-rimmed. "Ms. Vance?" His voice was a rasp, stripped of all its former arrogance. "The floors look clean," she said. It wasn't sarcasm, it was a simple observation. I'm doing my best," Gary whispered, shame coloring his cheeks a deep crimson. "Look, I just want to say, I know I can't apologize enough, but I lost everything. I'm paying for it every day." Sandra looked at the man who had tried to humiliate her. She searched her heart for anger, for that burning desire for revenge she had felt on the plane a year ago, but she couldn't find it. The fire had burned out, leaving only a cool, indifferent clarity. "I didn't take everything from you, Gary," Sandra said, her voice calm and devoid of malice. "You gave it away. You traded your life for a moment of feeling superior to a teenager in a hoodie. That was your trade." She stepped back, signaling that the conversation, and their connection, was over forever. "I hope the floors stay clean," she said. She turned her back on him. She didn't look back to see him crumple over his mop handle, weeping silently. He was a ghost of the past, and she had a flight to catch. Sandra returned to the gate where the students were lining up. The gate agent, a cheerful woman named Sarah, no relation to the student, beamed at them. "We are ready for boarding, Miss Vance. We have the entire upper deck reserved for your party." Sandra nodded. "Let's go." They walked down the jet bridge. The plane was a brand-new Airbus A380, the crown jewel of the Vance fleet. As they stepped onto the aircraft, the students gasped. To the left was the stairway leading to the upper deck suites. To the right was the main cabin. The students naturally started drifting to the right, toward economy. They had been conditioned by society to expect the back of the bus. "Myriad," Sandra called out. "Where are you going?" The group stopped. A girl named Sarah, a 16-year-old coding prodigy from the Bronx, with braids and thick glasses, looked at her confused. "To our seats." Sandra smiled and pointed to the stairs. "Upstairs, everyone." "Upstairs?" Sarah asked, her eyes widening behind her glasses. "But isn't that first class?" "It's Vance class," Sandra corrected. And today, you're the VIPs. The students erupted in whispers and cheers as they scrambled up the stairs. Sandra followed them up. The upper deck was a sanctuary of luxury. Individual suites with sliding doors, lie-flat beds, massive entertainment screens, and a lounge area with a bar that served smoothies and snacks. The students were afraid to touch anything. They stood in the aisles, looking at the leather seats as if they were museum exhibits. Sandra walked to the front, to Suite 1A. It was the best seat on the plane. It was spacious, private, and had a panoramic view. It was the seat Sandra had booked for herself. She looked at Sarah, the girl from the Bronx. Sarah was standing near the back of the cabin, looking at a smaller seat, clearly trying not to take up space. She held her backpack in front of her like a shield. Sandra remembered that feeling, the feeling of needing to be small to be safe. "Sarah," Sandra called out. The girl jumped. "Yes, Miss Sandra. Come here, please." Sarah walked up the aisle, nervously pulling at the sleeves of her sweater. Sandra gestured to Suite 1A. "This is your seat." Sarah froze. She looked at the suite, then at Sandra, then back at the suite. "Me? Oh, no, no, I can't. That's the boss seat. That's your seat." "I'm not the boss today," Sandra said, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I'm just the host. You worked hard for that scholarship, Sarah. You coded an entire app on a library computer because you didn't have internet at home. You earned this seat." "But what if I break something?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What if I don't know how to use the buttons?" Sandra leaned in close, her voice fierce and kind. "Then you ask, and the crew will help you, because you belong here, Sarah. Do you understand me? You belong in this seat. Don't let anyone, ever, tell you otherwise." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly. She stepped into the suite, sat down in the massive leather chair, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to expand. She stretched her legs. She put her arms on the armrests. She smiled. Sandra turned to the cabin crew, who were watching with misty eyes. "Take care of them," Sandra instructed. "Where will you be sitting, Ms. Vance?" the purser asked. "I'll be downstairs in row 40, Sandra said, picking up her bag. "I have a lot of reading to do, and I like the white noise in the back." As Sandra walked down the stairs to the economy cabin, leaving the luxury to the next generation, she felt lighter than she ever had in a private jet. She found her seat in the back, near the window. She buckled her belt. Next to her sat an elderly woman, knitting a scarf. The woman looked at Sandra. "You look familiar, dear," the woman said. "Do I know you?" Sandra smiled, pulling her headphones down around her neck. She looked out the window as the massive engines roared to life, pushing them forward, away from Gander, away from the past, and toward a horizon that was finally wide open. "I'm just a traveler," Sandra said. "Just like you." The plane lifted off, soaring into the clouds, leaving the shadows on the ground where they belonged. Sandra Vance's journey from a profiled teenager to a visionary leader proves that true power isn't about status. It's about character. The crew of that fateful flight tried to break her spirit by stripping away her dignity, but they only succeeded in revealing her strength. They judged her by her appearance, never realizing they were messing with a force that would dismantle their entire world. Sandra didn't just win a lawsuit. She rewrote the rules. She showed us that the best way to destroy an enemy is to build a world where their kind of hate can no longer survive. She turned her pain into a ladder for others to climb. If this story of ultimate redemption and justice inspired you, please hit that like button. It helps us share these stories with more people. Make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Who would you give your first-class seat to? Let us know in the comments below.